The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Illinois.
C2E2 has been around just about 4 years now. It's a great place for family, for friends to come to learn about their favorite TV shows, their favorite comic series, creators, with actors, anything within the world of comics.
Lots of artists in Artist Alley. It's what I really enjoy the most when I go to conventions. And some friends of mine actually have comic books that they're premiering here, I guess, at C2E2, and I'm here to support them. So.
We're launching The Protectors, my first comic book, and it's just the origin story of athletes, where they get their gift, their power, strength, speed, all the things that make them great in their sports. With The Protectors, I'm the creator. It was an idea I conceptualized in 2007 during training camp with the Bears. It's football every day, and in this particular year I said, I want to do something a little different, so my goal was to come out of that camp having created a story about sports. From there, we were able to add in some great talent and great creative minds. Ron Mars came in and crafted the story, and Bart Sears came in and put his pen on the paper and just destroyed the illustrations. He did a great job.
I'm attending C2E2 as a professional comic book artist. I've been a professional comic book artist for the last 25 years.
It's a much larger convention than I had thought.
This morning when they opened the gates and the sea of people came in, it's really great people. The energy is positive, and at the end of the day, it's a lot of fun.
The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is here to raise some money for our legal work and our program work. We raise money for any sort of free expression cases in the comic book community, and we've been around for 25 years fighting the good fight.
I was at C2E2 this year to take part on a panel related to how to integrate comics more easily into classroom settings and into school library settings. I've been a comics reader all of my life, though, for as long as I can remember. I was one of those really lucky kids because I grew up on the same block as the public library. The one day of the week that I didn't go to the public library was Saturday. And instead of going to the library, I went to the drugstore in town. And I would plop down on the tile floor and I would sit and I would thumb through all of the new comics. And of course I would always buy one or two.
Comic books have never been more popular. Probably the biggest blockbusters this coming summer are going to be comic book films.
But if you go back to the 1940s and 1950s, comic books in print form were substantially bigger than they are now. If you were to go back to 1950 and look at comics readership, you would have been, I think, astounded at what that readership looked like. Virtually every elementary-aged young person in the country reading comics regularly. The rates were something like 95% for boys and for girls. Comics had infiltrated into every aspect of their lives.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and
justice and the American way. It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's Superman.
There were comics characters like Superman and Batman who you could see on film.
No, I don't believe it.
Not only were kids reading comics, you might meet up on Saturdays or after school, trade comics with friends. Swap Wonder Woman for your Flash. form social clubs. Comics began to explore new territory, new genres, trying to find a new formula that would work, trying to increase their readership even beyond the levels it already was. Publishers really had pushed the envelope. They began to publish titles that really were provocative, lurid, sometimes violent and gory. They were sensationalistic. Across the United States, adults got energized about the problems of kids reading comics.
Sexy, crime-worshipping violence of certain comic books has come in for a lot of scathing criticism during the past couple of years.
As I said before, the most insidious feature of these publications is that they glorify crime and ridicule law and authority. Vice is presented as fun.
A lot of people were concerned about creepies, which would have been the horror comics. Stories about vampires and zombies, stories about crime, stories about war, stories that made a lot of adults uncomfortable. If you were a teenage boy in the 1940s and 50s and you were reading comics, chances are good that some of the comics you read would have been headlight comics. And headlight comics were the busty women comics. They were the ones who showed provocatively posed, scantily clad women that you could see their headlights quite clearly.
Well, what about the effect of these comic books on the children?
It is directly responsible for a substantial amount of juvenile delinquency and child crime.
This is how vandalism usually starts. Not planned, nothing to be gained or achieved. Destruction has boiled up and strikes out blindly against everything in its path.
Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing on into the 1950s, there were extraordinary national and regional and local efforts to restrict young people's access to comics.
Form a committee for decent literature within your community, civic or religious organization.
At a few junctures, civic groups even got kids to band together to go around their communities, collect other kids' comics, bring them back for a big comic book bonfire.
The whole comic book hysteria of the 1950s, it really fit in right in between the hearings on organized crime, McCarthyism,
And we'll be an island in a communist sea.
and then later looking into rock and roll.
Pick something groovy, Alex.
They were one of a string of monsters under the bed and hiding in the closet. They're here among us. We have to root it out before it ruins our national character.
Today, when we think about juvenile delinquency, we often think about kids perpetrating criminal mischief, criminal acts of some kind.
Come on, move it! What do you punks think you're doing anyway?
There certainly were kids who were carrying out horrible and violent crimes. But in the 1940s and 50s, juvenile delinquency was something a little bit simpler. There were kids who were simply truant from school. There were kids who might daydream, who might talk back to their parents.
Just where is it you're going, Jamie?
If I knew, I'd tell you. I don't know.
Who, for all intents and purposes, were simply acting like kids.
The real question is this: are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder, with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect.
For generations of comic book fans and readers, Frederick Wertham is one of the biggest boogeymen of all.
The arch-villain of the comic book world.
Bigger than Lex Luthor.
Frederick Wertham was, in essence, a child and forensic psychiatrist.
He was not a bad guy. He was a great guy. If he had not gotten involved in comics, he legitimately would have been a hero.
Treated children in the Lafargue Clinic in Harlem, mostly an African-American population.
This was in the 1940s, at a time when segregation, even in the northern states, was still a fact of life. Wertham took white doctors and black doctors into Harlem, made it affordable for people to come get comprehensive mental health and social work services. Wertham spent a lot of time talking with these kids quite directly about comics and their comics reading.
Very interested in how children were influenced by media, whether or not media played a role in them becoming violent, specifically crime and horror comic books.
He believed that crime comics would lead kids to become illiterate or have reading disabilities. Crime comics would lead kids to become juvenile delinquents. Crime comics would encourage kids to develop mental health disorders. Crime comics would essentially cause the breakdown of civil society.
I can only say that, in my opinion, this is a public health problem.
Was Wertham's heart in the right spot? I wonder about his intentions, if they were good. That's, I think, subject to conjecture.
He made the determination that all of the juvenile delinquents read comic books, just like every other kid in the country. It's like saying all these juvenile delinquents wear shoes, so these shoes must be making them turn to a life of crime.
One of the biggest problems with Wertham's argument, with his assertion that crime comics are bad, is his definition of what a crime comic is. Even Classics Illustrated could fall into the crime comic. Any comic in which something violent took place. A funny animal comic because there was physical violence taking place.
He was talking about Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and attaching a sexual subtext to the characters. Batman is practicing pedophile, Batman and Robin as gay lovers.
He had similar issues with Wonder Woman. She was promoting lesbianism, that she was promoting a strong femininity that was unrealistic, that was unhealthy, that even went as far as terrifying and terrorizing young male readers. Wertham took his anti-comics statements to the public. He was quite well received.
So he published his work in a book that he wrote, Seduction of the Innocent, in 1954.
As the voice of the anti-comics movement, he instilled a lot of urgency in the American people that something needed to be done about comics, to the point that comics were more or less put on trial by the U.S. Senate.
The only way that you can really stop this kind of thing is to arouse public opinion.
Estes Cavalver from Tennessee decided to have a Senate hearing into juvenile delinquency.
Mr. Chairman, as long as the crime comic book industry exists in its present form...
Wertham came in and testified for several days.
The Senate hearings provided an extended opportunity for Wertham to make his case that something needed to be done about comics.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
After the Senate hearings, the comics publishers realized that if we want to keep the government out of our business, we need to find a way of policing ourselves.
Comics Code Authority was put into place by the industry itself, trying to rein in some of the more extreme and more graphic, maybe the more violent type of illustrations that were done.
Pretty punitive list of concepts that they didn't want in comics anymore. Can't have terror in the title. The industry just almost completely shut down. He almost destroyed an art form.
Comics artists and writers were out of jobs. Many publishers went out of business. A lot of the innovation, a lot of the diversity diminished. Readership also declined. What had been the golden age, the real flourishing of this early decade and a half of development, went away. Years ago, academic comic studies were on the periphery. It wasn't something that you could study, that people would respond and say, oh, that's really fascinating. It was more to be on the outside, looking in. Certainly the 7 years I've been at University of Illinois, my interest in comics has been embraced. So throughout my research looking at librarians and how they responded to comics in the 1940s and 50s, Wortham was someone who you couldn't ignore. In 2010, his papers, which had been part of the Library of Congress since shortly after his death, were finally open to the public. There really wasn't a story there about librarians and teachers. I never did find that plethora of letters that he seemed to indicate was there. But what I did find were numerous systematic changes in what the kids had to say then as it was taken into the final book. Sometimes a small change, he would substitute a word. Sometimes he would make up entire sentences that he attributed to these young patients. Sometimes he would take a single young person turned into about 4 different kids in other places in the book. He also changes his words.
As Dr. Tilley's research showed, he was willing to cut corners and frankly lie.
The book has gone from being junk science to being just complete junk. I mean, there's nothing, you can't believe any of his claims.
So Carol Tilley's become a rock star.
When the Wortham article came out where I talk about the problems of Wortham's evidence, well, that piqued a little bit more interest than any of my previous work. It started out on some comics blogs, in the Twitterverse, and caught fire. And within a few days, it made its way into the pages of the New York Times, which for a historical scholar is not something that happens every day.
Comic books have a lot of positive things to offer. We sometimes get lost in the whole discussion about Dr. Wortham.
What I say now is, instead of having a relatively small, deep pool that we had at that time, we have this kind of wide, shallow pool of all these different subject matters.
In the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a resurgence in the publishers of comics. So that there are more independent and small publishers. There are more mainstream book publishers that are adding comics imprints. Comics aren't just superheroes. They're comics about science, so you can learn about nuclear fusion.
Reading with Pictures is devoted to facilitating and promoting the use of comics in the classroom. One of our stories that's involved in that is Dr. Sputnik, this dim-witted scientist who thinks he's a genius, who, with the severed, embalmed head of Isaac Newton, explains Newton's laws of motion.
The Protectors is a story that every man, woman, child, and especially children can connect with, and I think that's what makes it so great for our young adults and for our kids everywhere. You know, my opinion on comics in libraries is 100%. Every library should have a comic book section. Comic books have been a serious aspect of literacy for a lot of young readers.
If you go into any library and look around at the comics collection, you can get a real strong sense of the diversity and really great topics that are addressed in comics. My day-to-day job is teaching students at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science, students who are going to go out and be librarians in public libraries and school libraries working with kids. I want to encourage them to respect students, to give them things that they want to read, the stuff that's fun, that's exciting, that is going to be memorable. Comics are a big part of that. They're certainly not the only part, but they're a very big part.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Illinois in association with the Big Ten Network.